Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Newell. I'm Deputy Leader of the Rejoin EU Party. And this morning I wanted to talk to you about the importance of being European after Brexit. And this is a topic which I've been stimulated to talk about by a recent book that was presented at a European Movement conference, a very interesting book called The Failure of Remain. It's a book by a couple of academics. I'll show you the cover here. There we are. The Failure of Remain, Anti-Brexit Activism in the United Kingdom by Anne Fagan and Stein van Kessel. And it's all about why the Remain movement in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, among other things, failed to achieve a second referendum that was being demanded at the time. And one of the points they make is that a reason for this failure, among others, was that members of the movement didn't have a very clear idea of what they saw the UK's role in Europe as being, and they didn't have a very clear vision of the future of Europe itself. So the whole campaign was very UK-centric, in other words. So that stimulated me to put together this short PowerPoint presentation, which I've entitled "The Importance of Being European Citizenship After Brexit." And I want to address three questions in particular. First of all, why is European integration important? Why are European identities important for achieving the goal of greater European integration? Because I want to argue that if European integration, as I believe it is a good thing, then one of the essential conditions for achieving it is a greater sense of European identity. And then thirdly, I want to look at the conditions under which these European identities are likely to be increasingly adopted and consolidated. So if we start by looking at why is European integration important, clearly to answer this question, we have to understand what European integration means to begin with. And I think I can say without too much fear of being contradicted that European integration usually refers to the process whereby member states have increasingly transferred their sovereignty to the supranational European institutions, as a consequence of which we've seen greater uniformity in the rules and regulations governing an increasingly wide range of economic and social activities within the member states. And that's because in establishing the European institutions and European law, the treaties creating them have given rise, with respect to the member states' legal systems, to a superior legal order, whereby European law is directly applicable in the member states and so cannot be overridden by domestic law. Now, there are four reasons why I think European integration in this sense is important. The first is that it's made possible the development of the single market and economic and monetary integration. So what do I mean by these terms? Well, the term single market refers to a process of economic integration between states, a process that begins with the establishment of a free trade area. That defines a situation in which there are no tariffs on trade between the member states participating in it. The next stage in the process of economic integration is the establishment of a customs union, which describes a situation in which, in addition, there are unified tariffs on the external borders of the free trade area. In the case of the European Union, member states achieved a customs union by 1968, and it now means that the European Commission negotiates trade deals for and on behalf of the member states collectively, and represents them in the World Trade Organization without the member states having to do these things on their own. So we can already see a second reason why European integration is important, because obviously one can imagine that an entity larger than its member states, like the EU, is able to negotiate more favorable trade deals than would be possible if each member state was obliged to negotiate them on their own behalf. a point that seemed to be lost on those campaigning for a leave vote in the 2016 Brexit referendum. Moving on then, 1986 saw the signing of the Single European Act, which was a treaty establishing a deadline of the 31st of December 1992 for the completion of a single market. So what's a single market? Well, a single market represents a step forward from a customs union in the process of economic integration, and that is because it starts from the recognition that even in the presence of a free trade and customs union, internal trade can still be restricted by several intangible trade barriers, such as diverging public procurement policies, domestic subsidies and industry bailouts, licensing, different packaging and labelling requirements, different health and safety regulations, and so on. So the creation of a single market, which is still an ongoing process, was and is designed to harmonise all of these things across the member states in order to guarantee the free movement of goods, capital, services, and labour. Clearly, if you're able to harmonise regulations, so that firms seeking to sell their products in the various markets of the EU only have to conform with a single set of regulations rather than the multiple regulations of each of the member states individually, then that will facilitate trade. It will make it easier, therefore make it more likely to happen. Finally, however, European policymakers were aware that even with the single market, there remained a further significant obstacle in the way of trade between member states that was constituted by the fact that the member states still had their own currencies. Now, why was this an obstacle? It was an obstacle because the value of states' currencies relative to those of other states fluctuate constantly, and sometimes they change in unpredictable ways. So to illustrate why this is a problem, I'd like you to imagine that you are a producer of nails in Italy. Don't ask me why I'm talking about nails. It was the only thing I could think of to illustrate the point. So I'd like you to imagine that you're a producer of nails in Italy and you produce a packet of nails which you can sell for 2,000 lire a packet. Now let's imagine that you want to sell your packets of nails also in the German market, and let's imagine that the exchange rate between the Italian lira and the German Deutschmark is 1 Deutschmark to 1,000 lire. Well, in this scenario, obviously you're going to need to sell your nails in the German market for 2 Deutschmarks per packet, so that when you take your Deutschmarks back to Italy and you change them back to lira, you get 2,000 lira and you manage to cover your costs, okay? Now let us imagine that all of a sudden there's a change in the exchange rate, the value of the lira against the Deutschmark suddenly rises so that only 500 lira are necessary in order to purchase 1 Deutschmark. Clearly, in that scenario, if you continue to sell your nails at 2 Deutschmarks a packet in the German market, when you bring your Deutschmarks back to Italy and you try to change them, you're only going to get 1,000 lira for your Deutschmarks. And in that case, you may not be able to cover your costs. So what do? Well, you might think of increasing the price at which you sell your nails in Germany. You might decide, okay, so from now on, I'll have to sell my nails at 4 Deutschmarks a packet rather than 2. In that way, when you bring your Deutschmarks back to Germany, back to Italy, and exchange them for lira, you'll get your 2,000 lira and therefore be able to cover your costs. However, the problem is, or could be potentially, that if you raise your price in the German market in order to ensure that you get the same amount of lira when you bring the Deutschmarks back to Italy, that the price is too high for German consumers, so you're unable to sell your nails at all. So you've got a real big problem. Either you can't cover your costs, or the price you need to charge is too high for consumers to be able or willing to buy your product. So fluctuating exchange rates are a problem for businesses, and make them very wary about selling products in markets other than their domestic ones. So in 1999, we got the launch of the single currency. The notes and coins came into circulation in 2002. And the single currency was designed to complete economic and monetary integration and to provide for an expansion of trade. Now, you might be wondering, okay, at that point, why is trade important? Why would we want an expansion of trade in the first place? Well, the reason why we might want it was explained well over 200 years ago by a famous economist by the name of David Ricardo, who put forward the theory of comparative advantage. So what does the theory of comparative advantage say? Well, it says that even if a country is more efficient at producing all imaginable goods than another country, it will still pay both countries to concentrate on producing the goods in which their relative advantage is greatest and to engage in free trade with each other, rather than attempting to produce everything without engaging in trade at all. So, to illustrate this theory, Ricardo asks us to imagine that the world economy consists of two countries, England and Portugal, and two commodities, wine and cloth. Now, what you can see is that in this imaginary economy, Portugal is more efficient at producing both wine and cloth than is England. Why? Well, if you have a look at this graph here, what you can see is that it takes Portugal only 90 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth, whereas it takes England 100 hours of labor to do so. Likewise, in the case of wine, Portugal can produce 1 unit of wine with only 80 hours of labor, whereas England has to expend 120 hours. However, what you can also see is that England is more efficient in producing cloth and wine, and Portugal more efficient in producing wine than cloth. Why? Well, in the case of England, England can produce 1 unit of cloth by expending only 100 hours of labor, whereas it takes 120 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of wine. Likewise, in the case of Portugal, Portugal can produce 1 unit of wine by expending only 80 hours of labor, whereas if she wants to produce 1 unit of cloth, she's got to expend 90 hours of labor. Okay, so relatively speaking, Portugal is more efficient in producing wine than cloth, and England is more efficient in producing cloth and wine. So the idea is that if both of them specialize, if they each give up producing the thing in which their relative advantage is lesser, so in other words, if Portugal gives up producing cloth and concentrates exclusively in producing wine, and England gives up producing wine and it concentrates exclusively on producing cloth, even though Portugal in absolute terms is more efficient in producing both commodities, if they concentrate on producing the commodity in which their relative advantage is greatest, and then they engage in free trade, then everybody can be better off as a result of that. And this is illustrated by these two graphs here, where we see that before specialization, where both countries are attempting to produce both commodities, we only get 2 units of each, yes? So England expends the 220 hours of labor available to get 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wine, and likewise Portugal expends the 170 hours of labor that she has available, likewise, to get 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wine. If they specialize, on the other hand, so in other words, if we come and have a look at the graph here on the right-hand side, what we see is that with specialization, England now spends the 220 hours of labor she has available to be able to produce 2.2 units of cloth. Portugal likewise uses the 170 hours of labor that she has available, and as a consequence is able to produce 2.125 units of wine. So production increases, and as I say, if then the two countries engage in free trade with each other, they can all be much better off. So this really goes to the heart of why economic integration, at least, is important, because it facilitates trade and prosperity. Now, you might be asking yourself then at that point, so what? Who cares about trade? Why is its expansion a good thing? Don't we have too much trade? I mean, after all, many people suggest that it's our relentless pursuit of ever-increasing material wealth, rather than trying to redistribute the enormous stock of wealth that we already have available, that is at the root of such problems as climate change, for example. Well, I'll come back to climate change in a moment, but first let us try to understand why efforts to expand trade, like those involved in European integration, might be a good thing. It is arguably a good thing because, among other things, the founders of the European Union were aware of two things. The first was the way in which competition in trade, the imposition of tariffs, the refusal of member states, of European states, to embrace free trade with each other in the 1920s and 1930s, the fact that they engaged in competitive devaluations of their currencies against each other to try to expand their own trade at the expense of the trade of other European states, that contribute at least in part to the rise of Nazism and fascism in the 1930s. The second was the belief that general prosperity contributes to the stability of democracy, making it less likely that we'll see the emergence of extreme parties threatening to democracy, able and willing to exploit popular resentments and fears arising from people's senses of material poverty and insecurity. So I think it's perhaps no accident that across Europe generally, in the more recent period, the period since the 2008 financial crash and the imposition of austerity, that we've seen the emergence and growth of populist far-right parties. Not all of these parties are explicitly anti-democratic by any means, but nevertheless, they've arguably weakened democracy by helping to create a climate of fear and intolerance, especially towards migrants and refugees and people deemed to be different in other ways. Because, of course, when people are fearful, when people feel insecure, when they're struggling economically, they tend not to vote for openness and freedom, but rather they look to authoritarian leaders who promise them security and provide easily identifiable scapegoats. So that's why trade and prosperity, I think, is important. The fourth reason why I think European integration is important is that in a globalized world, that is a world in which economic, political, and social relations are increasingly extending beyond national boundaries. Many of the problems that face European citizens, and indeed citizens generally, are simply too large for individual states to deal with on their own. They require cross-national collaboration in order to address them effectively. The obvious example here is climate change. Another example was the COVID-19 pandemic, which spread rapidly thanks precisely to international travel and the cross-border relations that helped to make this possible. The globalized world pandemics spread much more rapidly, of course, than they did before. The world was so closely integrated. With the development of COVID vaccines, I think it became fairly clear that none of the world's citizens could be made completely safe unless all of them were. So again, international cooperation important. Third example concerns the regulation of the economy. Now, traditionally, reformist parties of the left that until recent years sought to use the levers of public policy making to develop and sustain welfare states, providing guarantees to citizens against the threats arising from poverty, unemployment, sickness, lack of education, and old age. And they sought to regulate the free market in order to ensure that citizens were not exploited by unscrupulous employers, by being paid too little, by being forced to work in unsafe environments. by having insecure contracts of employment, by being denied the right to organize themselves in trade unions, and so on and so forth. So one of the most significant developments of the period since the 1970s has in fact been the way in which economic globalization has, in a variety of ways, limited the capacity of reformist parties to pursue such policies by draining power away from individual nation states through, for example, the emergence of large global corporations, which have effectively been able to force states to compete with each other for inward investment by offering low tax environments, which thereby limit the resources available to parties seeking progressive reform. So the idea here is that if we want to continue to enjoy a progressive politics, then in order to counter the power of large multinational corporations, we need political structures, forms of political organization, and forms of democracy that extend beyond nation states. Fourth example concerns the increased international migration that we've seen in recent years, driven by wars, famines, climate change, that have created really unprecedented movements of people across borders in recent years. And as is well known, this is an area that's created considerable difficulty for the European Union in recent years. Now, management of refugees arriving in Europe takes place according to something known as the Dublin Principle, which is an EU law establishing the member state responsible for considering an asylum application that is based primarily on the first point of entry and obliges the state concerned to take back those who have lodged applications in a different member state. Now, states such as Italy, with external EU borders, have long argued against the Dublin Principle. And they've done so on two grounds. One is that they lack the resources to offer asylum seekers effective support and protection on their own. And the second is that the EU already has a common external border and a common visa policy, thanks to the Schengen Agreement, which was incorporated into EU law in 1997 and which has abolished almost all internal border controls. And so, therefore, countries like Italy argue that the management of refugees and asylum seekers should become a common European concern, implying a willingness on the part of member states generally to offer support and protection, not only those representing the first port of entry. Italy, of course, having a common having a border which is also an EU border, if you see what I mean, because it juts out into the Mediterranean. Now, one often hears complaints about the supposed unwillingness of Europe to address this problem effectively, but this is mistaken in my view, because it's not Europe that's unwilling to address the problem effectively, but it's member states that are unwilling. So Italy, for example, has tried on many occasions to get the agreement of other member states within the Council of the European Union to agree to the establishment of a common European approach to the management of asylum, but it has had very little success in doing so because other member states have been highly resistant to that. And they've been highly resistant, at least partly because of the way in which policy making takes place in Europe. It takes place at least in part through the Council of the European Union, which is one of the EU's two legislative bodies alongside the European Parliament. and which represents the member states. So essentially what happens is that the European Commission has the power of legislative initiative. Proposals are then considered in the Council of the European Union, which, as I say, represents the member states, and are considered by the European Parliament. And if the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament can find agreement on an identically worded text, then the proposal becomes law. However, in the Council of the European Union, policy making there, decisions are made by something known as qualified majority voting. But in practice, policy making tends to take place by consensus. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the reasons why Europe has had difficulty in developing a common European approach to asylum in recent years has less to do with Europe itself, but with the obstruction of the individual member states within the Council of the European Union. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the difficulties of developing a common asylum policy have to do with the fact that not that we've had too much integration in recent years, but on the contrary, that we've had too little integration. So that's why I think European integration is important. Let's move on to look at why European identities are important for achieving greater European integration itself. So the first thing we need to consider is what we mean by European identity. What I mean by European identity is the sense on the part of individuals that besides being Italian, French, Polish, or whatever citizens, they are also citizens of Europe. Okay. So what is a citizen? What do we mean by citizenship? Well, a citizen is a member of a political community and who therefore enjoys certain rights with respect to that community, as well as certain obligations towards it. You know, if you're a member of anything, a football club or whatever it happens to be a member of something means to have certain rights with respect to the collectivity, and also certain obligations towards it. So we're all familiar with democratic citizenship in this sense. We are aware that in return for the right to equality before the law, to a range of civil and political rights, as well as social rights associated with the welfare state, we're aware that we have a range of various obligations. So these will include the obligation to be law-abiding, to contribute to the common welfare by paying our taxes honestly, and to contribute to collective processes of decision-making by being politically informed and voting in elections. Now, why is citizenship in that sense important? Well, it's important because to the extent that it involves having a long list of rights and obligations shared with other citizens, the individual is thereby placed in a relationship of equality with other citizens. And that's thought to be a factor contributing to the cohesion of states. So citizenship helps to create a feeling of solidarity between the members of a political community. And because of that, it has another very important effect. That is, it enables people to feel a sense of common ownership towards their political institutions and their political representatives. And it's precisely this sense of ownership with regard to political institutions and political representatives that confers legitimacy on the political authorities and their decisions, and thereby gives them political stability. So a notable scholar of European integration, somebody by the name of Middelaar, Luc van Middelaar, put this very well when he wrote the following. He said, Every day, any national government, in Poland, say, takes decisions that can be contested to various degrees by often opposition parties, can be disliked by voters, even trigger protests or strikes. As a general rule, however, even the protesters accept the legitimacy of the Polish government itself. They might want the Polish Prime Minister to leave office tomorrow, but they would still consider him our infuriating Prime Minister and speak of our disappointing Parliament and our bad laws. Political identity trumps the outcome of the political process. So, citizenship, European identity, and the legitimacy that this confers on European institutions are essential for the strength of the European institutions themselves, and therefore for their capacity to make further integration a reality. We all know that the European institutions have been undergoing a crisis of legitimacy in recent years. So if we want to get over this crisis and drive integration forward, then we have to find ways of raising the salience among Europeans of their senses of themselves as European citizens. So this then leads on to the final question, which is under what conditions will European identities be adopted and consolidated? And in my opinion, four things are essential for this to happen. They are, first of all, the creation of a European public sphere. Secondly, European democratization. Third, the role of the political parties. And then fourthly, the role of European citizens themselves. Okay, so what do I mean by the creation of a European public sphere? What is a public sphere? Well, the public sphere is difficult to define, but essentially it consists of all those institutions such as legislatures, all those rules such as those governing free speech, and all those organizations in civil society such as political parties, pressure groups, and so on. All of these things together constitute the public sphere, and they're the entities through which society's members interact with each other and with the authorities for political purposes. So the public sphere, in other words, is the forum through which members of society and their organizations seek to influence what the authorities and their representatives do. So the public sphere, in that sense, links state and society. In doing that, it enables citizens, it's the entity through which citizens, in seeking to influence the authorities, in interacting with each other, it's the entity through which citizens assert the rights and obligations that make them citizens in the first place. It's the arena which, if you like, allows people to feel that they actually are citizens. So, in other words, what I'm saying is a bit as the old advertisement said, no martini, no party, no public sphere, no citizens. Yeah, if we want citizenship and a sense of European identity, we need to take steps towards the development of a European public sphere. That's why it's important. The problem is that unfortunately hitherto the European public sphere has been relatively weakly developed, and you can see this immediately if you think of political parties and media systems. Think in that context of elections to the European Parliament. So what happens when there are elections to the European Parliament? These elections, unfortunately, hitherto have been far closer to being national rather than genuine European context, in the sense that the focus of the media, of the parties and voters in each of these elections is focused squarely on national issues. Moreover, because European Parliament elections are considered less important than elections to national parliaments, parties and the media give them far less attention than they pay to national parliamentary elections. Consequently, turnout at European elections tends to be very low. And finally, there's very little evidence that voters, or any sizable proportion of voters, cast their votes in European Parliament elections on the basis of European-wide as compared to national issues. Yeah. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that political parties, media systems, all focus very squarely on national issues. There's very little sense of a concentration on European-wide issues, and consequently, very little sense of there being a European public sphere in which people can feel a sense of European citizenship. So we need to take steps to ensure the greater development of the European public sphere. How can we do this? Well, this then leads on to the final three reasons why, or the final three conditions that I think are important for the consolidation and adoption of European identities. So the first of these has to do with European democratization. So there are various measures that have been discussed and debated in European circles in Europe in recent years, designed to enhance democracy within the European Union. One is the development of transnational lists. What do I mean by transnational lists? What I mean by that is the proposal which came before the European Parliament in the run-up to the last European Parliament election in 2019 and was almost passed, and would have made it possible for European political parties to present candidates in a single cross-national constituency, as opposed to the various constituencies for the European Parliament that at the moment are all contained within national borders. So the idea is that if you had transnational lists, you would oblige the European political parties to focus more squarely on European-wide issues, on issues that are debated within the European Parliament, and not solely on national issues, and thereby you would contribute to the emergence of a European public sphere. The second is known as the Spitzenkandidaten system. So what is this? Well, this relates to a provision that was contained in the 2007 Treaty of Lisbon, which obliges the Council of the European Union to consider the outcomes of European Parliament elections in making their decision about who to appoint as the Commission President. So this led the European Parliament, the European parties, in the European Parliament elections of 2014 and also in those of 2019, to adopt leading candidates, Spitzenkandidaten, who were their candidates for the position of President of the European Union, on the assumption that if they won the largest proportion of votes, they would thereby be able to put political pressure on the Council of the European Union to adopt their candidate as the Commission President. So here the idea is that if you can strengthen this process by giving the citizens of Europe the sense that their vote will also help to determine the identity of the President of the European Commission, you give them an additional reason to think that voting and participating in European Parliament elections is worthwhile. A third proposal that's been discussed is giving the European Parliament the power of legislative initiative. Yeah, at the moment, the power of legislative initiative is monopolised by the Commission, and the European Parliament can at most act as a vetoing body against proposals. It can't actually initiate proposals on its own. So again, if you give that power of legislative initiative to the European Parliament, you give people an additional reason for thinking that voting in European Parliament elections is important. And fourthly, there is the European Citizens Initiative. So the European Citizens Initiative is an agenda-setting instrument that allows 1 million citizens from at least a quarter of the member states formally to request that the Commission propose legislation falling within the areas of its competence. And the significance of the European Citizens Initiative is that since it relies on the mobilisation across Europe of individuals and groups that might otherwise remain uninvolved in the EU's process of consultation of civil society organisations, it was envisaged that it would have the potential, like the other three proposals, to contribute to the emergence of a European public sphere. So the idea is to strengthen the European Citizens Initiative. So thirdly, then, in terms of strengthening European identities, is the role of political parties. And political parties are important in helping to spread and reinforce European identities because parties as campaigning organisations perform pedagogical functions. Now, how do parties campaign? Well, parties campaign by developing a narrative. What is a narrative? Well, a narrative is a story. It's a story that tells citizens who they are, where they've come from, where they are at the moment, and where they're going. So political parties are very important in giving citizens their senses of political identity. Yeah. Now, the Italian political parties are very good at this because if you wander around any town in Italy, what you will find outside every government building is two flags. One is the European flag, and one is the Italian flag. So in other words, the Italian political parties, its political system, the political class, if you like, it takes active steps to draw on the pedagogical function of political parties to inculcate, give citizens the opportunity to feel that as well as being Italian, they are also European, something that the British political parties have never done. So as a consequence, when we came to the 2016 referendum, what happened? People had never been given the opportunity to see themselves as both British and European. So when we came to the 2016 referendum, we got this scurrilous poster produced by the Leave campaign, which, as you can see, tried to convey the message that far from being able to see yourself as both British and European, you were obliged to consider yourself as either European or British. In other words, you couldn't be both, because political parties in Britain have never taken it upon themselves to perform this pedagogical function of enabling citizens to see themselves as both British and European. So that may be partly why we got the result of the 2016 referendum that we did. Then finally, if we want to help consolidate a European public sphere and therefore a sense of European citizenship, and therefore to consolidate processes and make possible further advances on the road to European integration, is the role of us as European citizens. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there are several things that European citizens can do to help spread and reinforce senses of European identity. One, if we're students, if we're European students, is to become involved in the Erasmus Plus program and feel a sense of European citizenship by taking advantage of the opportunities that the program offers to live and work in other countries of the Union. A second is to learn a foreign language, since one of the most significant obstacles in the way of the emergence of the European public sphere, and therefore a sense of European citizenship, is that too few of us speak a language other than the one of the country that we were brought up in. A third of it is that we can become involved in one of the transnational European parties or pressure groups, campaigning for a more integrated democratic Europe, as do groups like European Alternatives or Citizens Take Over Europe or UMAND or the Democracy in Europe movement 2025, which is led by the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. And then finally, a fourth is simply if we are lucky enough to have European citizenship and to live in one of the EU countries, to make sure that we vote in European Parliament elections, that we are informed about EU politics, and that we're prepared to defend the great benefits that the European Union has given us. So that's about it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that what I've had to say has been of some use to you, and I will look forward to seeing you again when I'm able to produce another of these videos. Thanks very much. Goodbye.